The laughter spread through the group of admirals like a wave. And Kira stood there and let them laugh because she knew they would stop eventually. This is not a joke. Human, the Korath admiral said when he finally caught his breath. We are discussing matters of galactic importance here. Run along back to your engines and let the adults handle this. I am not joking, Kira said. And something in her voice made the laughter die down. I have seen the schematics of Korath Prime, and I know there is a way in. The officers exchanged glances with each other, and the Korath leaned forward with his yellow eyes narrowing. What way? He asked, his tone still dismissive, but now carrying a hint of curiosity. The thermal exhaust network, Kira said. It runs from the surface all the way down to the detention. Levels unguarded because the heat would kill anyone who tried to use it. Exactly, the Korath said as he waved his hand in the air. The temperatures in those vents exceed 200 degrees. No living creature can survive that. No creature you know of, Kira said. But I am from Earth. The table went silent, and Kira could see the understanding slowly dawning on some of their faces. The Deathworld, a Vellani officer whispered, and there was fear in his voice. My planet's average summer temperature in some regions exceeds 45 degrees, Kira explained, and our bodies can survive internal temperatures of over 41 degrees before we start to die. I have worked in environments hotter than anything you have ever experienced, and I am still here. The Korath opened his mouth to argue, but another voice cut him off before he could speak. Let her try. Everyone turned to look at the speaker, and Kira saw an elderly Vellani standing at the edge of the group with his hands clasped behind his back. His crystalline skin had faded with age to a pale blue color, and his eyes held the weight of centuries of experience. Ambassador Therian, the Korath said with obvious surprise. Surely you cannot be serious. I am entirely serious, Ambassador Therian said as he walked forward until he was standing next to Kira. I have read the classified reports on human physiology. Admiral reports that you clearly have not bothered to review. He turned to look at Kira with those ancient eyes, and she felt like he was seeing right through her. Humans are persistence predators, he said. They evolved on a world where they would chase their prey for days without stopping, running through heat and cold and pain until whatever they were hunting simply collapsed from exhaustion. That sounds like an exaggeration. The Korath muttered. It is not, Therian said firmly. Humans have run races of over 100 miles through desert terrain. They have climbed mountains so tall that the air becomes too thin to breathe. They have survived injuries that would kill any other species in the galaxy. He looked back at the admirals with something like disappointment in his expression. You have sent 400 ships against Korath Prime and lost them all, he said. You have thrown 50,000 soldiers at those walls and watched them die. What do you have to lose by letting one human try? The admirals looked at each other, and Kira could see the calculation happening behind their eyes. They did not believe she would succeed. That much was obvious, but the ambassador was right about one thing. They had nothing left to lose. Very well, the Korath finally said as he leaned back in his chair. If the human wants to throw her life away, who are we to stop her? He waved his hand at one of the junior officers nearby. Give her a shuttle and whatever equipment she needs, he said. And make sure the paperwork is in order so nobody can blame us when she fails. Kira felt anger rise in her chest at his dismissive tone, but she pushed it down and nodded instead. Thank you, Admiral, she said. And she turned to leave before anyone could change their mind. Ambassador Therian walked with her as she made her way toward the hangar bay, his thin legs moving in quick steps to keep up with her longer stride. You understand what you are attempting, he said. It was not a question. I do, Kira said. The Sar are not like other species, Therian continued. They are warriors born and bred for combat. Their empire was built on conquest and violence, and they have never lost a war in their entire history. There is a first time for everything. Kira said. Therion made a sound that might have been a laugh if Filani could laugh. I suppose there is, he said. But I want you to understand something before you go. I did not speak up for you because I think you will succeed. Kira stopped walking and turned to face him. Then why? She asked. Because I have seen what hopelessness does to a people, Therion said. And there was old pain in his voice. The coalition is ready to give up. They believe that nothing can be done, that the Tsar is simply too powerful to defeat. He reached out and placed one of his delicate hands on her arm. Even if you fail, he said, you will show them that someone was willing to try, and sometimes that is enough to change everything. Kira looked down at his hand and then back up at his face, and she saw something there that she had not expected to see from any alien. Respect. I am not planning to fail, she said. I know, Therion said. And that is why I have hope. He released her arm and stepped back. Go now, he said. Time is short and the princess is waiting. Kira nodded and continued toward the hangar, her boots echoing against the metal floor as she walked. The shuttle they gave her was small and old, barely held together by rust and prayers. But it had a working stealth system, and that was all she really needed. She spent 3 hours gathering equipment, a heat-resistant suit patched together from engine insulation and emergency blankets, a rebreather that could filter toxic air, a knife that had been her father's before he died, and a small pistol that she hoped she would not have to use when she was ready to leave. She found a young Korath soldier waiting by the shuttle's boarding ramp. He was smaller than the Admiral and younger too, with scales that had not yet darkened to their adult color. Why are you doing this? He asked, and there was genuine confusion in his voice. Kira stopped and looked at him, and she thought about the question for a moment before answering. Because where I come from, she said. We do not leave people behind, not ever. The soldier stared at her like she had just spoken in a language he did not understand. But you do not even know the princess, he said. She is not your people. She is not your family. Why would you risk your life for a stranger? Kira smiled, and it was not a happy smile. Because someone has to, she said. And nobody else is stepping up. She turned and walked up the ramp into the shuttle, and the door closed behind her with a soft hiss. She sat down in the pilot's seat and began the startup sequence, her hands moving across the controls with practiced ease. Through the viewport, she could see the stars waiting for her. Cold and distant and full of danger, somewhere out there was a fortress that no army could breach, and a princess who was running out of time, and somewhere out there was a warlord who had never known defeat. Wow, Kira said to herself as the shuttle lifted off the deck and turned toward the void. Let us see if we can change that. The shuttle shot forward into the darkness, and Kira Vance went to war. The wrench slipped from Kira's grease-covered hand and clanged against the metal floor of the engine bay, and she cursed it under her breath as she bent down to pick it up again. She had been working on this particular starship for 6 hours straight, her muscles aching and her back sore from crawling through tight spaces that no other species on the station could fit into. That was the thing about being human on a galactic coalition station. Everyone needed you for the jobs nobody else could do, but nobody really wanted you around when the work was finished. Kira Vance was 23 years old, born and raised on a farm in Montana on a planet called Earth, and she had been working as a mechanic on Harmony's Edge station for almost 2 years now. Pay was decent, and the work was steady, and that was more than most humans could say in a galaxy that still looked at her species like they were dangerous animals that had somehow learned to talk. She tightened the last bolt on the engine housing and wiped the sweat from her forehead, leaving a dark smear of oil across her skin. You are finished already? A voice asked from behind her, and Kira turned to see Veloth standing in the doorway with his crystalline eyes wide in that expression she had learned to recognize as surprise Voth, was a Valani, one of the most common species in the coalition. And his body was thin and delicate with bones that looked like they were made of glass, because they basically were. Yeah. All done, Kira said, as she climbed down from the engine platform and grabbed her tool bag. But the estimated repair time was 14 hours. Veleth said, his voice carrying that musical quality that all Valani possessed. And you did not even use the mechanical assistance frame. Kira shrugged as she walked past him toward the exit. And she could feel his eyes on her back as she went. She knew what he was thinking. Because they all thought it, every alien on this station looked at her the same way they looked at her, like she was something that should not exist. Like she was a monster wearing the skin of a person. Earth was a Class 12 Deathworld, one of the most dangerous planets in the known galaxy. And the fact that humans had not only survived there, but had built civilizations and developed space travel was something that most species simply could not understand. Gravity on Earth was 3 times stronger than on most inhabited worlds, which meant that Kira's bones were denser, and her muscles were stronger than almost any alien she had ever met. The weather on Earth was violent and unpredictable, with storms that could tear buildings apart and temperatures that swung from freezing to boiling depending on where you stood. The wildlife on Earth included predators with claws and teeth and venom and speed. And humans had spent thousands of years learning how to fight them and kill them, and sometimes even tame them, and the diseases, the bacteria and viruses that lived inside every human body would kill most alien species. Within hours of exposure, Kira had grown up thinking all of this was normal, because it was the only world she had ever known. She had baled hay under the summer sun when the temperature reached over 100 degrees, and she had walked through snowstorms in winter that would have frozen a Valani solid in minutes. She had broken her arm, falling out of a tree when she was 8 years old, and it had healed in 6 weeks. Without any permanent damage, she had caught the flu when she was 12 and had spent a week in bed feeling miserable, before her immune system had crushed the virus into nothing to her. She was ordinary, just a regular person doing regular things, but to the rest of the galaxy, she was a nightmare that walked on 2 legs. Kira made her way to the station commissary to grab some food before her next shift, and she found a seat in the corner where she could eat alone without anyone staring at her too much. The commissary was crowded today, filled with coalition officers and diplomats and merchants from a dozen different species, and the noise of their conversations filled the air like the buzzing of insects. She was halfway through her meal when the main view screen on the wall flickered to life and a news broadcast began to play. Confirmed reports that the hegemony of SAR has established a complete blockade around the Valani homeworld, the announcer was saying. And the room went quiet as everyone turned to watch. Kira looked up from her food and saw images of massive warships surrounding a blue-green planet, their weapons pointed at the surface like the claws of some enormous beast. The SAR warlord Thalvex the Unbroken has issued demands for the complete surrender of the Valani government, the announcer continued, and has taken High Chancellor Marath's daughter, Princess Alindra, as a hostage to ensure compliance. A murmur ran through the commissary, and Kira could see the fear on the faces of the Valani around her. 3 coalition rescue fleets have attempted to breach the SAR defenses at the fortress moon of Koreth Prime, the announcer said. But all 3 attempts have failed with catastrophic losses, over 400 ships destroyed and more than 50,000 coalition soldiers killed. Kira set down her fork and stared at the screen as images of burning ships and floating debris filled the display. Military analysts have declared the fortress impenetrable, the announcer said, and coalition leadership has admitted that they have no viable plan for rescuing Princess Alindra before the SAR deadline expires in 10 Standard cycles. The broadcast ended, and the commissary erupted into conversation. Voices rising in anger and fear and despair. Kira sat in silence and watched the people around her panic. And she felt something stir in her chest, something she had not felt in a long time, at a nearby table. A group of coalition admirals were arguing about what to do next. Their voices loud enough for her to hear. "It cannot be done," a Korath admiral said as he slammed his webbed fist against the table. "No army in the galaxy can breach Korath. Prime the shields alone require more firepower than we possess. Then we must accept the Tsar's demands." Another officer said, "Or the princes will die. Surrender is not an option." The Korath snapped back. "But neither is victory. We are trapped." Kira listened to them argue for several minutes, and her mind drifted back to the schematic she had seen last week. A Tsar transport had come through the station for repairs, and Kira had gotten a look at its navigation database while she was working on the engines. She had seen the layout of Korath Prime, including the thermal exhaust network that vented heat from the fortresses core deep into the moon's surface. The vents were unguarded because no species could survive in there. The temperatures exceeded 200 degrees standard, hot enough to melt most equipment and kill any living thing that tried to pass through. But Kira remembered summer in Montana, when the air shimmered with heat and the ground burned through the solace of cheap. She remembered her father's forge where metal glowed red and orange and white, and she remembered standing next to him as he taught her to shape iron with hammer and flame. She remembered walking through heat that would make a Vellani pass out just from hearing about it. The admirals were still arguing when Kira stood up from her table and walked toward them. And she did not stop until she was standing right in front of the Korath with the loud voice. "I can do it," she said. And every officer at the table turned to stare at her like she had just grown a second head. "I can get in and bring the princess out." The Korath laughed, and it was not a kind sound. "You?" he said as he looked her up and down with obvious contempt. "A single human mechanic against the entire hegemony of Tsar?" "Yes," Kira said, and her voice did not waver. "Me." The fortress moon of Korath Prime hung in the void like a dark jewel, its surface covered with weapons platforms and shield generators that made it look more like a machine than a natural. Satellite Kira guided her shuttle through the debris field that surrounded the moon, the remains of the coalition, fleets that had tried and failed to breach the Tsar defenses. She passed by the burned hulls of battleships and the scattered pieces of fighters, and she tried not to think about how many people had died in those ships. The Perst of Diustins the Shimper, not to think about how many people had died in those ships. The bear stealth system on her shuttle was old but effective, and she slipped past the outer patrol lines without triggering any alarms. The Tsar were not expecting anyone to come this way. Why would they? When their fortress had crushed every attack with ease, they were looking for fleets and armies, not for a single small shuttle piloted by a woman from a backwater planet. They had never heard of. Kira found the thermal vent entrance on the dark side of the moon, a massive opening in the rocky surface that glowed red with the heat pouring up from below. She landed the shuttle on a ridge about half a mile away and suited up in the gear she had assembled. The heat-resistant suit was bulky and uncomfortable, made from layers of engine insulation wrapped around emergency thermal blankets. And she knew it would not last long once she entered the vents, but it did not need to last long. It just needed to last long enough. She strapped her father's knife to her belt and holstered the pistol at her hip. And then she stepped out of the shuttle and into the airless night of Korath Prime. The walk to the vent entrance took 15 minutes. And by the time she reached it, she could already feel the heat radiating up from below like the breath of some enormous beast. She stood at the edge and looked down into the red glow. And for just a moment she felt fear crawling up her spine. Then she thought about the princess sitting in a cell waiting to die. And she thought about the admirals who had laughed at her. And she thought about her father teaching her to stand in front of the forge without flinching. She jumped. The heat hit her like a physical wall as she descended. And she grabbed onto the metal ladder that ran down the side of the vent shaft, just in time to stop herself from falling. The temperature was already over 100 degrees and climbing. And she could feel sweat pouring down her face inside her helmet. She began to climb down, one rung at a time, moving as fast as she could while still maintaining her grip. The ladder was old and corroded, and twice she nearly lost her hold when a rung crumbled under her weight around her. The walls of the shaft glowed orange with heat, and the air shimmered like water in a mirage at 200 feet down. Her suit's outer layer began to smoke at 300 feet. The thermal sensors on her wrist showed a temperature of 150 degrees at 400 feet. The outer layer of her suit caught fire, and she had to tear it off while still climbing, leaving her in nothing but the inner insulation layer and her rebreather. Heat was incredible now, pressing against her skin like 1,000 burning hands. And every breath felt like she was inhaling flame, but Kira kept climbing. She remembered the summer she had turned 15, when a wildfire had swept through the mountains near her family's farm, and she had spent 3 days helping the firefighters dig trenches and carry equipment through smoke so thick she could barely see. She remembered her father's voice telling her that fire was just another tool, that heat was just another challenge, that anything could be survived if you were strong enough and stubborn enough to keep going. The ladder ended at a horizontal passage, and Kira pulled herself into it with arms that felt like they were made of lead. The passage was narrow and low, forcing her to crawl on her hands and knees through air that burned her throat. With every breath, her inner suit layer was starting to fail now, patches of insulation falling away to expose her skin to the raw heat. She felt blisters forming on her arms and legs, and her vision was starting to blur at the edges. But she could also see a light ahead, a different kind of light, cooler and wider than the red glow of the vents. She crawled toward it with everything she had left, pulling herself forward inch by inch until she finally tumbled out of the passage and onto a metal floor that felt almost cold compared to what she had just been through. She lay there for a long moment, gasping for air and trembling with exhaustion. And then she forced herself to stand up and look around. She was in a maintenance corridor deep inside the fortress, exactly where the schematics had said she would be. T-walls were bare metal and the lights were dim, and there was no one in sight. The Tsar had not bothered to post guards down here because they had never imagined that anyone could make it through the thermal vents alive. They had built their fortress to be impenetrable, and they had forgotten that the universe always finds a way. Kira stripped off the remains of her ruined suit and checked her equipment. The knife was still at her belt, the pistol was still at her hip, and the rebreather was still functioning. Marilish was burned and blistered and exhausted, but she was inside. Now came the hard part. She moved through the corridors like a ghost, using the maintenance passages to avoid the main hallways where the Tsar soldiers would be patrolling. The fortress was enormous, a maze of tunnels and chambers carved into the heart of the moon, and it took her almost an hour to find her way to the detention level. She encountered her first guards at a junction where 4 corridors met. 3 Tsar soldiers standing in a loose group and talking in their harsh, guttural language. They were big, each one standing over 7 feet tall, with thick gray skin covered in armored plates, and they carried weapons that looked like they could punch through steel. Kira watched them from the shadows for a moment, calculating distances and angles. Then she moved. The first guard died before he even knew she was there, her knife sliding between the plates of his armor and into his spine with a precision that came from years of hunting deer in the Montana wilderness. The second guard turned at the sound of his companion falling, and Kira was already on him, her hands closing around his throat with a grip that had been forged in Earth's crushing gravity. His eyes went wide with shock as he realized that this small creature, this thing that barely came up to his chest, was stronger than him. He tried to call for help, but she crushed his windpipe before he could make a sound. The third guard managed to raise his weapon, but Kira was faster. Ducking under his aim and driving her knife up into his chin, he fell without a cry. And the corridor was silent again. Kira stood among the bodies of 3 Sar warriors and felt nothing but cold determination. She had killed before predators on Earth that had threatened her family's livestock. Criminals on the station who had thought a human woman would be easy prey, and she had learned long ago that hesitation was just another word for death. She cleaned her knife on one of the guards' uniforms and continued toward the detention cells. The princess was close now. She could feel it, and nothing in this fortress was going to stop her from bringing that girl home. Princess Alindra had stopped counting the days since her capture, because counting only made the waiting worse. She sat in the corner of her cell with her knees pulled up to her chest, her crystalline skin dull and gray from lack of proper light and nutrition. And she tried not to think about what was going to happen when the deadline arrived. The Tsar had been clear about their intentions. If her father did not surrender, she would be executed in front of the entire galaxy as a demonstration of what happened to those who defied the hegemony. She had accepted that she was going to die. There was a strange peace in acceptance she had discovered, but she had not accepted that her death would mean the end of her people's freedom. The sound of fighting in the corridor outside made her lift her head. She heard shouts and crashes and the unmistakable sound of bodies hitting the floor. And then there was silence. The door to her cell slid open with a hiss, and Alindra pressed herself back against the wall in fear. But the figure that stepped through the doorway was not a Tsar guarded, was something she had never seen before. A small creature, barely taller than she was, with soft pink skin that was covered in burns and blisters and blood. The creature's eyes were a strange color brown, like tree bark, and they held a fierce intensity that made Alindra's breath catch in her throat. "Who are you?" she whispered. "My name is Kira," the creature said, and its voice was rough and raw, like it had been screaming for hours. "I am here to take you home." Alindra stared at her in disbelief. "That is impossible," she said. "The fortress is impenetrable. No one can get in. And yet here I am," Kira said. And there was something that might have been a smile on her damaged face. "Come on, princess, we need to move." She reached out and took Alindra's hand, and the princess was shocked by how warm and strong her grip was. "What are you?" Alindra asked as Kira pulled her out of the cell and into the corridor. "Human," Kira said. "From a planet called Earth." "I've never heard of it. Most people have not," Kira said. "But they will after today." They moved through the corridors quickly, Kira leading the way with her knife in one hand and her pistol in the other. Alindra saw the bodies of Tsar guards lying in their path, 5, 10, 15 of them, and she could not understand how this small creature had killed so many. The Tsar were the greatest warriors in the galaxy, feared by every species in known space. And this human had cut through them like they were nothing. They were almost to the shuttle bay when the alarms finally started. Red lights flashed in the corridors, and a harsh voice boomed through the speakers. And Kira cursed in a language Alindra did not understand. "They know we are here," Kira said. "We need to run." They ran, but they did not get far. The corridor ahead of them filled with Tsar soldiers, 50 of them at least, pouring out of doorways and side passages until there was nowhere left to go. Kira pushed Alindra behind her and raised her pistol. But she knew it would not be enough. Even she could not fight 50 warriors at once, and then the soldiers parted. And something massive walked through their ranks. Warlord Thalvex the Unbroken stood 8 feet tall, his body wrapped in armor that had been forged from the hulls of conquered ships, and his eyes burned with a cold yellow fire that made Alindra want to weep with terror. He looked at Kira and laughed a deep, booming sound that echoed off the metal walls. "This," he said, his voice dripping with contempt, "this is what the Coalition sends against me? One female from a backwater rock?" "One is enough," Kira said, and her voice did not waver. Thalvex laughed again, and his soldiers laughed with him. "You have courage, little creature," he said. "I will give you that more courage than the admirals who sent their fleets to die against my walls." He took a step forward, and Kira could feel the floor shake under his weight. "I have crushed armies," he said. "I have burned worlds. I have broken the backs of empires that thought themselves invincible. And you think you can stand against me?" "I do not think," Kira said. "I know." Thalvex's eyes narrowed, and for a moment the amusement faded from his face. "Very well," he said. "I will give you a chance to prove it. Single combat, you and me. No weapons, but our own bodies." His soldiers murmured in surprise, and Kira could see the confusion on their faces. "If you win," Thalvex continued, "the princess goes free. Our honor demands it. But if I win, you both die here and now." "Agreed," Kira said without hesitation. Alindra grabbed her arm with desperate hands. "You cannot," she whispered. "He is the greatest warrior the Tsar have ever produced. He has never been defeated in combat." Kira looked back at her and smiled. "Neither have I," she said. She handed her knife and pistol to Alindra and stepped forward to meet the warlord. Thalvex removed his armor piece by piece, revealing a body covered in scars and dense with muscle. And when he was done, he stood before her like a mountain of gray flesh and barely contained violence. "Come then, little human," he said. "Show me what a Deathworld can produce." Kira attacked. She moved faster than anything Thalvex had ever seen, her body a blur of motion as she closed the distance between them in an instant. Her fist connected with his jaw, and she felt the shock of impact run up her arm like lightning. Thalvex staggered, and the look of surprise on his face was worth all the pain she had endured to get here. "Impossible." He breathed. "Just getting started," Kira said. And she hit him again. The fight that followed was brutal and savage. Two predators from different worlds testing each other's limits. Thalvex was stronger than her. She could feel it every time he landed a blow, but she was faster and more enduring. And she had been fighting for her survival since the day she was born. He broke 2 of her ribs with a single punch, and she kept fighting. He opened a gash on her forehead that poured blood into her eyes, and she kept fighting. He threw her against the wall so hard that she heard something crack in her spine, and she got back up and kept fighting, because that was what humans did. They endured. They adapted. They refused to die no matter how much the universe wanted them to. And slowly, inevitably, Thalvex began to tire. His movements became slower. His breathing became heavier, and Kira saw her opening. She grabbed his arm when he swung at her and twisted with all her strength, using the leverage she had learned from wrestling cattle on her family's farm. And she felt the bones snap under her hands. Thalvex screamed the first time anyone had ever heard him scream, and Kira did not stop. She kicked his knee and felt it buckle, and she grabbed his other arm and broke that too. And then she stood over him as he knelt before her in the ruins of his pride. "On my world," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "the weak do not survive, but the strong protect each other." She looked down at him with eyes that held no mercy but also no cruelty. "Yield," she said. Thalvex looked up at her, and for the first time in his long and bloody life, he understood what it meant to face something he could not defeat. "I yield," he said. The corridor was silent. The silence in the corridor stretched on for what felt like forever. And Kira stood over the broken warlord with her chest heaving and her body screaming in pain. Every breath sent fire through her shattered ribs, and the blood from her head wound had turned half her face into a crimson mask, but she was still standing. And Thalvax the Unbroken was on his knees before her. The Sar soldiers stood frozen in place, their weapons lowered and their eyes wide with a shock that bordered on religious terror. They had watched their greatest warrior, the legend who had never lost a battle, who had conquered worlds and crushed empires, be defeated by a creature half his size. None of them moved to attack. None of them raised a weapon, and Kira understood why. Saw honor was not just a phrase. It was the foundation of their entire civilization. Talos had made a challenge, and he had lost. And every Sar present knew what that meant. The princess goes free, Thalvax said, his voice hoarse with pain and something that might have been shame. As I promised. He looked up at Kira with those yellow eyes, and she saw something new in them, not hatred, not anger, but a strange kind of respect. You have earned your victory. Human, he said. Take it and go. Kira nodded and turned to Alindra, who was still standing against the wall with Kira's knife and pistol clutched in her trembling hands. Come on, princess, Kira said. Time to go home. Alindra moved to her side on legs that did not seem entirely steady, and Kira gently took her weapons back before putting an arm around the younger woman for support. They walked through the ranks of Sar soldiers, and not one of them raised a hand to stop them. Kira could feel their eyes on her, could feel the weight of their attention like a physical force, and she kept her head high and her steps steady, even though every movement sent fresh waves of agony through her battered body. They reached the shuttle bay without incident, and Kira found her old ship still sitting where she had left it, its rusty hull looking completely out of place among the sleek Sar fighters that surrounded it. She helped Alindra up the boarding ramp and into the passenger seat, and then she collapsed into the pilot's chair with a groan that she could not quite suppress. You are badly hurt, Alindra said, her voice filled with concern. I have had worse, Kira said. And it was almost true. She started the shuttle's engines and guided it out of the bay, and no weapons fired at them as they left. No fighters launched to pursue them. She looked back through the rear viewport and saw the fortress moon of Karth Prime shrinking behind them, that impenetrable stronghold that had destroyed fleets and broken armies. And she allowed herself a small smile. You did it, Alindra whispered, and there was wonder in her voice. You actually did it. We did it, Kira corrected her. We are not safe yet. Still have to get back to the station. The flight back to Harmony's Edge took 6 hours, and Kira spent most of it fighting to stay conscious while Alindra watched over her with worried eyes. The princess had found the shuttle's medical kit and had done her best to bandage Kira's wounds, but they both knew that she needed real medical attention soon. When the station finally came into view, Kira felt something loosen in her chest that she had not even realized was tight. They had made it against all odds, against everything the galaxy had thrown at them. They had made it. The docking procedure was automatic, which was good because Kira was not sure she could have managed it manually. When the shuttle's door opened and the boarding ramp extended, she tried to stand up and immediately fell back into her seat as her legs refused to cooperate. Let me help you, Alindra said, and she wrapped her thin arm around Kira's waist and pulled her upright together. They made their way down the ramp, and what they found waiting for them made Kira stop in her tracks. The entire docking bay was filled with people, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, coalition officers and diplomats and merchants and workers from every species she had ever seen on the station. They were all silent, all staring at her with expressions that ranged from disbelief to awe to something that looked almost like fear. And then Ambassador Therian stepped forward from the crowd, his ancient face wearing a smile that made his crystalline skin glow. Welcome home, he said. The crowd erupted. The sound was overwhelming cheering. and shouting and applause that echoed off the metal walls until it felt like the whole station was shaking. Kira stood there with Alindra's arm around her waist and let the noise wash over her, and she did not know whether to laugh or cry. The Korath admiral who had dismissed her was there in the front row, and his face was pale with something that might have been shame. "How?" he asked when the noise had died down enough for him to be heard. "How did you do it?" Kira looked at him, and then she looked at all the faces surrounding her. The people who had laughed at her, who had pitied her, who had thought she was nothing special. "I walked through fire," she said simply, "and I did not stop." Alindra stepped away from her and turned to address the crowd, and her voice rang out clear and strong, despite everything she had been through. "Your fleets failed," she said. "Your armies failed, but this woman succeeded." She gestured to Kira with one slender hand. "She came alone to a fortress that no one could breach," Alindra continued. "She fought through heat that would have killed any of you. In seconds, she defeated warriors with her bare hands. She broke the greatest warlord your galaxy has ever known." Her voice dropped to something softer, but it carried through the silent bay like a whisper in a cathedral. "Not because she had numbers or firepower," she said, "but because she carried something inside her that all of you have forgotten exists." She turned to Kira and met her eyes. "What do your people call it?" She asked. Kira thought about her father standing at the forge, about her mother tending crops under the burning sun, about all the generations of humans who had fought and bled and died on a world that wanted to kill them every single day. "Grit," she said. The word hung in the air like a promise, and Kira could see it taking root in the minds of everyone who heard it. She was taken to the medical bay after that, where doctors worked for hours to repair the damage she had done to herself: broken ribs, cracked vertebrae, second-degree burns, internal bleeding. The list went on, and every physician who examined her shook their head in amazement that she was still alive. But she was alive, and so was the princess, and that was all that mattered. In the days that followed, the news of what had happened spread across the galaxy like wildfire. Every species in known space heard the story of the human woman who had walked through a furnace and defeated an empire. Tsar Hegemony withdrew from Volani space without firing another shot, and warlord Dalvax was never quite the same after his defeat. Some said he had found religion, while others said he had simply found fear, and humanity was no longer the pitied species from the Deathworld, the dangerous animals that had somehow learned to talk. They were something else, now something that the rest of the galaxy could not quite name but desperately wanted on their side. Kira returned to work in the engine bay 3 weeks later, her body still healing but her spirit stronger than ever. When other mechanics asked her how she had done it, she just shrugged and smiled. "I grew up on Earth," she would say, "and Earth does not break." And whenever someone in the galaxy wondered how a single human had done what no army could do, the answer was always the same: because she was from a Deathworld, and Deathworlders do not know how to give up.